All right, today we're going to read pages 90 to 96, and we're going to look at slide 18. It's always good to look at your questions before you read. Looks like there's a few multiple choice questions, so that you can probably read on your own and answer on your own. So let's look at this one. How does the author develop suspense with the following line? You, George, you stick with us so we don't think you had nothing to do with this. So when you're reading, you're thinking to yourself, what is this? Okay. So you're thinking who did what, why, how was it solved? I'm thinking something like that. And then we'll say which adds suspense because. All right, so these are kind of some things you want to think about as we read today. 90 to 96. I actually did read page 90 and 91 before. What basically happened was I'll review my notes on the bottom of page 91. George always knew how strong Lenny was. He knew that he killed or hurt a lot of things that he touched. And in the last section, he accidentally ended up killing first a puppy and then Curley's wife, both because they were so soft. But maybe maybe George himself was hurting for company so much that he turned a blind eye to things that could have happened, even though George knew otherwise. Otherwise, he would not have made a plan for Lenny to go somewhere if he got in trouble. So I'm just going to restart over on the bottom of 91. George was a long time answering. Guess we got to tell the guys. I guess we got to get him locked up. We can't let him get away. The poor bastard will starve. And he tried to reassure himself. Maybe they'll lock him up and be nice to him. But Candy said excitedly, "We gotta let him get away. Why, you don't know that, Curly. Curly gotta want to get him lynched. Curly's gonna want to get him killed." George watched Candy's lips. "Yeah, that's right, Curly will. And the other guys will." He looked back at Curly's wife. Now Candy spoke his greatest fear. "You and me, we can get that little place, can't we, George? You and me, we can go there and live nice. Can't we, George? Can't we?" Before George answered, Candy dropped his head and looked down at the hay. He knew. George said softly, "I think from the very first, I think I knew we'd never do her. He just liked to hear about it so much, and I got to thinking maybe we would." "Then it's all off?" Candy asked sulkily. George didn't answer his question. George said, "I'll work my month, I'll take my $50, and I'll stay all night in some lousy hotel. Or I'll sit in a pool room till everybody goes home, and then I'll come back and work another month, and I'll have a $50 more." Candy said, "He's such a nice fella. I didn't think he'd do nothing like this." George stared at Curly's wife. "Lenny never did nothing in meanness. All the time he done bad things, but he never did none of them mean." He straightened up and looked at Candy. "Now listen, we gotta tell the guys. They gotta bring him in, I guess. There ain't no way out. Maybe they won't hurt him. I ain't gonna let them hurt Lenny. Now you listen. The guys might think I was in on it. I'm gonna go into the bunkhouse, then in a minute you come out and you tell the guys about her." So now this is interesting because it kind of also goes with our question. So here George is again making a plan. This specifically to cover his Patuski. So, again, George is making a plan. I don't like this thing is in the way. Which is the start of the suspense. Alright. And I'll come along and I'll make like I never seen her. Will you do that so the guys don't think I was in on it? Candy said, sure, George, I'll do that. Alright, give me a couple minutes then, and you come running out, and you tell just like I found her. I'm going now. George turned and went quickly out of the barn. Old Candy watched him go. He looked helplessly back at Curly's wife, and gradually his sorrow and his anger grew into words. You goddamn tramp! You done it, didn't you? I suppose you're glad. Everybody knows you'd mess things up. You was no good, and you ain't no good now, you lousy tart. I could have hold the garden and washed dishes for them guys. He paused, then went on in a sing-song, and he repeated the old words. If there was a circus or a ball game, we would have went to her, and just said to hell with work, and we would have went to her. Never asked nobody, it says so, and they've been pigs and chickens, and in the winter, and that little fat stove, and the rain coming, and us just sitting there. His eyes blinded with tears, and he turned and went weakly out of the barn. He rubbed his bristly whiskers with his wrist stump. So again, at this point, you can go back, and it says, so this is actually Candy talking. I could have hoed in the garden, washed dishes for those guys. So this is a stream of consciousness. This is like, let me take a note here. One of the themes that we talked about earlier was like, kind of like the shattering of dreams. Okay. And so, Candy, he's the old swamper. Candy's, I'll call it a speech, was him, basically admitting the dream they had is shattered. And he's blaming it on Curly's wife. So when you look up that, I'm not sure why it says George here, because this is actually Candy here. So it should say Candy is, okay? And see what you get for that one. So now we have to look for the line, you, George, you stick with us so we don't think you had nothing to do with this. So in some aspects, we kind of know who, George. Well, actually, Lenny. This is from the previous section. Did what? Killed Curly's wife. Why? On accident. So what we need is, how is it solved? So George develops a plan to, I'm going to say, turn Lenny in. But we still need this part up here. And when the men say, and you can actually copy this, paste it here. We'll, instead of which add suspense, we'll say this adds suspense because. Okay, so let's keep reading and see about that final answer. Outside, the noise of the game stopped. There was a rise of voices in question, a drum of running feet, and the men burst into the barn. Slim and Carlson and young Wit and Curley and Crooks, keeping back out of the attention range. Candy came in after them, and last of all came George. George had put on his blue denim coat and buttoned it, and his black hat was pulled down low over his eyes. The men raced around to the last stall. Their eyes found Curly's wife in gloom. They stopped, stood still, and looked. Then Slim went quietly over to her, and he felt her wrist. One lean finger touched her cheek, and then his hand went under her slightly twisted neck, and his fingers explored her neck. And when he stood up, the men crowded near, and the spell was broken. Curly came suddenly to life. "I don't know who done it," he cried. "That big fella done it. I know he done it. While everybody else was out there playing horseshoes." He worked himself into a fury. "And I'm gonna get him. I'm going for my shotgun." Oh, sorry, I was thinking it's Candy, so I was reading it in Candy's voice, but this is Curly, the wife or the husband. "I know who done it. That big guy done it. I know he done it. While everyone else was out there playing horseshoes, he worked himself into a fury. I'm gonna get him, and I'm gonna get my shotgun, and I'll kill that big guy myself. I'll shoot him in the guts. Come on, guys." He ran fiercely out of the barn. Carlson said, "I'll get my lugger," and he ran out too. So even right here, this is adding suspense, because the men want to kill Lenny. Slim turned quietly to George. "I guess Lenny done it all right. Her neck's bust. Lenny could have done that." George didn't answer, but he nodded slowly. His hat was so far down over his forehead that his eyes were covered. Slim went on. "Maybe like that time in Weed you was telling about?" Again, George nodded. Slim sighed. "Well, I guess we gotta get him. Where do you think he might have went?" It seemed to take George some time to free his words. He would have went south. We come from the north, so he would have went south. "Well, I guess we gotta get him," Slim repeated. So again, the reader knows that George is lying here. The reader can infer he is still trying to protect Lenny, because he didn't tell him he was going to go hide in the bush by the tree in the stream. George stepped close. "Couldn't we maybe bring him in and they'll lock him up? He's nuts, Slim, but he didn't do this to be mean." Slim nodded. "We might. If we could keep Curly in, we might, but Curly's going to want to shoot him. Curly's still mad about his hand, and suppose they lock him up and strap him down and put him in a cage. That ain't no good, George." I know. Carlson came running in. "The bastard stole my lugger," he shouted. "It ain't in my bag." Curly's followed him, and Curly carried a shotgun in his good hand, and Curly was cold now. This is an important piece of information right here. So basically, what we're learning here is that Carlson's gun is missing. He thinks Lenny took it. Let's see if he's right. All right, you guys. We got a shotgun. You take it, Carlson. When you see her, don't give her no chance. Shoot for his guts. That'll double 'em over. Wit said excitedly, I ain't got a gun. Curly said, you going to Soledad and you get a cop. Get A.I. Wiltz. He's deputy sheriff. Let's go now. He turned suspiciously on George and he says, you're coming with us fellas. So here's that word, suspiciously, because he knew that the two of them, and then, here it said, George said, yeah, I'll come, but listen, Curly, the poor bastard's nuts. Don't shoot him. He don't know what he was doing. Don't shoot him, Curly cried. He's got Carlson's lugger. Of course we're going to shoot him. George said weakly, maybe Carlson lost his gun. I seen it this morning, said Carlson. No, it's been took. Slim stood looking down at Curly's wife, and he said, Curly, maybe you ought to stay here with your wife. Curly's face reddened. I'm going, he said. I'm going to shoot the guts out of that big guy myself. Even if I only got one hand, I'm going to get him. Slim turned to Candy. You stay with here, then, Candy. The rest of us better get going. They moved away. George stopped for a moment beside Candy, and they both looked down at the dead girl until Curly called, You, George. Oops. Here's where he's saying it. Oops, I'm trying to get the marker here, but it's not working very well. There we go. You, George, stick with us so we think that you had nothing to do with this. Okay. So, I think what we could do here is answer this a little bit. Let's answer it here. Okay. So you could say this line adds suspense because it may, we'll say it does not give George the opportunity to warn or help Lenny if he's with the other men. Okay, so that's the line that you should put around in here. All right, let's finish this really quickly. George moved slowly after them, and his feet dragged heavily. And when they were gone, Candy squatted down in the hay and watched the face of Curly's wife. Poor bastard, he said softly. The sound of the men grew fainter, the barn was darkening gradually, and in their stalls the horses shifted their feet and rattled their halter chains. Old Candy lay down in the hay and covered his eyes with his arm. This isn't a question, but I do think that this is a good point here. I think the line covered his eyes with his arm is just a continuation of his sorrow being expressed that his dream won't come true. And I guess if you want to get more metaphorical or symbolic, it's as dead as the woman he is lying next to. That could be kind of symbolic. Very sad, though. And we will see you tomorrow.